Okay. Today I'm going to talk about why I left Goldman Sachs. In light of Goldman Sachs just like being in the news a ton, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience at the firm and why I left, which was largely due to racism. I think it's really important that people entering places like Goldman Sachs or finance in general know what they're getting into and how ill-equipped it feels like Goldman was to handle the concerns that I had while I was at the firm. This is especially prevalent with things like their analyst survey right now, which has select quotes like, "I can't sleep anymore because my anxiety levels are through the roof." Retweet. We're back to crying every day. One of the most wild quotes to me from their whole survey was, "The sleep deprivation, the treatment by senior bankers, the mental and physical stress. I've been through foster care and this is arguably worse." I wanted to talk about this issue because I think Goldman Sachs has known about this stuff for a long time. And I think you see it in like the response to things like the survey where people are like, "Oh, well, you knew what you were getting into," or like, "Well, you knew Goldman Sachs was going to be racist when I left the firm." It's one thing to know those things in your head and another to hear people kind of preach to you how exciting and wonderful of an opportunity you're getting, and then to arrive and feel like that's not the case. So for context, I graduated from Yale University in 2019. I had previously interned in experienced tech recruiting in HR at Goldman my junior summer. I actually really liked it. There were definitely little moments of uncomfortableness. Things like people looking to me to be the voice for like Black female engineers when I wasn't a Black female engineer. I was just the only Black woman in the room. I had conversations with people like the chief diversity officer that I thought were really uncomfortable. I ended up speaking to their head of HR on kind of his race rhetoric and why I found it incredibly inappropriate. That was never really properly addressed. My HR experience though largely was pretty positive. I still have friends from that internship. I really liked most of the people I worked with, and overall I was like pretty content. But I really wanted to be in the front office and I wanted to work with the stock market. So as an intern, you have this option to do internal mobility where you reapply basically within the firm. I had met some senior kind of sponsors who had made that easier for me, and I was able to reapply and re-interview and move over to private wealth. So I entered Goldman Sachs private wealth division in May of 2019. 10 days after I graduated. Because I was coming into a new division, I asked if I could start early, and so I was the only analyst in my group who started when I started. 2 other analysts started early as well, but a little bit after me. But I sat on a team that felt like the working conditions weren't super great. Spent a lot of really late nights in the office. I cried a lot, felt like I was disrespected, but overall I was like, okay, I can power through this for a couple of years and then leave the firm. And so I was pulled aside by private wealth management and asked if I wanted to join this group called PCG, or the Partners Coverage Group. PCG's a private wealth team that sits on a separate floor and was founded primarily to address the needs of the partner class at Goldman Sachs. So all partners at Goldman receive free private wealth services, and I was asked to join that team. When you Google that team, things come up very quickly. Namely that they had been involved in a previous lawsuit that had to do with anti-Semitism and race. And so interviewing, I had seen select quotes about the team that I was going to join. I raised those concerns to private wealth management, who was like, "No, it's gonna be fine, like just interview, they wanna see you." I also raised that another analyst specifically wanted to be on that team and I didn't, and they said that they had picked me and wanted me. So I interviewed with a couple people and ended up being selected to move to this like more prestigious team called PCG. Going into that, I knew that the hours would be worse and I knew that the environment was a little bit different, but I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And I want to be very frank that I was really, really excited to work at Goldman Sachs, which is why I think I found the experience so disheartening. I've been a campus ambassador for Goldman, where I had worked on Yale's campus while I was a current student, doing things like office hours and organizing events, and just working in that space to make the campus a better recruiting process for kids, since so many Yale students want to work at Goldman. Specifically though, Yale brings back a couple senior leaders, one of whom was also named in that racial lawsuit, and I found it really inappropriate that she by herself would do things like host events in the African American Student Center. Moments like that just made me question Goldman's like racial judgment from an HR perspective, but when I joined the firm, I was super, super, super excited. And I'm still really upset with the experience I was given. I had known that the team had had issues with race, and going in, I had kind of been warned by some people that there might be concerns. And I had actually been given specific names of people who to avoid while on the team. I'm gonna reference a document that I had sent to HR over and over, so all of these complaints HR was very aware of, and I'll get into kind of HR's mishandling of the situation in a moment. But basically, pretty early on, so in November of 2019, a team member of mine was on and a white MD came over and said, "Who's that gorilla?" And I kind of sat there in shock. I was sitting next to another analyst at the time who looked at me and said, "When things like that happen, we just look away and try not to laugh." I think that incident was pretty jarring in itself. I had never heard a Black person called a gorilla in a professional work setting, but the mishandling of that incident is what really spiraled my experience out of control. I did not mishear this comment. Multiple other people heard the same thing and affirmed that in like HR investigations, but it really felt like I was made the scapegoat of the incident, as if it was like my fault for being offended in that moment. There was no acknowledgement from HR really or my team about how blatantly racist and hurtful that comment was, and no one in my direct chain of command ever really took accountability. Yeah. I told someone I trusted, another Black woman on my team, about the incident, who escalated it, and it was just like escalated all the way up to management, and then the next day they started like whatever investigation or whatever was gonna happen. But again, it felt like it was my fault. So I was publicly pulled off the desk multiple times to speak to people. I was pulled by my manager, who apologized, who I thought was pretty good at that apology. And then I was pulled by the person who made the comment, who was like, "Well, I didn't say that." And that's where I was like, uh-oh, this isn't gonna go well. The person who made the comment spoke to me in his office and didn't admit to making the comment, nor did he apologize. He only said that he was sorry if I misunderstood who he was referring to and didn't realize that the comment could have racial connotations. That feels a little fake, but all right. And then like, it just kind of felt like everything spiraled out of control. I had been asked to move to the seat next to the person who made that racist comment, who had a history of making other racist comments that I hadn't heard. Things like referring to the SPX as SPIC. I had been told that he had called a shoe shine guy a that he had made comments about women's boobs and Black women's hair and other things like that. So I escalated to my manager that I wasn't comfortable sitting next to him in that capacity. He also had 2 separate offices. So I was like, if you really need him to work on the team still and you're not gonna do any sort of punishment, can you just have him sit in one of his offices so I don't have to deal with these type of racial comments on a daily basis? That was not allowed. I ended up being moved to sit next to him anyway. I guess at the end of the day, there was sort of disciplinary action, but he just retired 3 months later, and there was never really any addressing of the incident, or like no one ever mentioned that it was like bad in itself, or like part of the reason he was being let go, or like why he was retiring. So I still don't know if he was ever punished in any capacity. And even after he had announced his retirement, he still interviewed multiple Black candidates one-on-one, which I think is incredibly inappropriate. I was moved away from him at the end of the day, which further made me seem like the problem, which just felt a little bit ridiculous. I went to HR 3 times about this incident, like all the way up the chain of command in HR, and it didn't really feel like anyone ever addressed it until I was literally out of the door. I guess like the overarching theme is like, it was very much swept under the rug, but it wasn't from my experience personally. So some of the direct consequences for me personally from that incident, I was told that people didn't want to work with me because they were scared of being sued. I was told that people didn't want to work with me because they were scared of saying something offensive. There was a ton of tension on the team. A group chat was formed without me of people in my peer group. Also, once I raised a lot of these concerns, it seemed like my workload went up when other people's didn't. The team was pretty consistent about being there from 7 a.m. to like 5 to 7 p.m. as like a general guideline. There obviously were a lot of like later nights, like where I would leave at midnight, 1, 2, whatever. But after I reported the incident and all of that, I ended up working much later than the other analysts, which I thought was really weird because the team had a culture of walking around and asking other people like, hey, can I grab anything from you if you were heading out before other people? and there were multiple nights after the incident where I would be in the office till 2 or 3 in the morning with just a ton of work when other analysts would have left at 8 p.m. And that inequity was pretty visible to me. And I raised that to my manager and people were like, well, that's just you're not working well. Which was a little interesting because there were people on the team who were known for working much slower than me. And I had been told over and over and over that I was a very high performing analyst, so that just didn't seem feasible. And I spoke to the analyst manager who was the direct mentee of the person who made the gorilla comment and also worked very, very, very closely with him. I just expressed that I felt like there were tensions on the team and other analysts were borderline acting in a retaliatory manner. She said that none of the events had racial bias, and I admitted that while they may not have bias in race, they had connotations that felt that way. And because many of the behaviors intensified after the incident or were directly tied to the incident, they felt very much tied to my race. To my knowledge, this was never addressed with me or the other analysts. The behaviors continued until I left the firm. And I also expressed discomfort at the idea of hiring another Black woman who was the incoming analyst who we hired at the end of the day. In that conversation, I explained multiple events, such as the being told that white advisors weren't comfortable being around me after the incident, people asking how I felt about getting him fired or congratulating me on getting him fired, being staffed at a much higher workload. Another analyst would shush me on the desk on multiple occasions. This same analyst told me I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom for as long as I did the week after I had surgery. Other analysts would talk down to me and speak in an incredibly condescending manner, and those interactions only seemed to happen to me and not to anyone else. Other analysts not asking if they were able to help with my workload as they left the office, which is a team-wide practice. Other analysts not telling me when they plan to come in on the weekend or outside hours as a group to get work done, and overall just not being included in the culture. And I want to stress that this wasn't just one incident that blew up. I recognized very early on that I was othered in a lot of situations, which may be because I was added to my team's class late, but also felt very tied to race. In things I would have meetings with advisors with me and another analyst, and the advisor would only speak to the white analyst. Moments like that were just a little weird and set off some alarm bells. Other inappropriate racial comments on the desk. This is a fun section. There was an Asian advisor whose last name sounded close to Wuhan, and when COVID started, they started calling his name Wuhan on the desk, which I thought was a little inappropriate. When I mentioned that this comment was inappropriate, it was immediately laughed off. Other analysts repeated the name over multiple days. Another advisor mimicked the Indian accent on the help desk message on a regular basis, which I thought was incredibly rude. When we were interviewing a potential candidate, I had heard feedback via the Black network, which I mentioned, and people said that they were super uncomfortable that we had a Black network as a whole. That was a cool one. In speaking to Black women on the team, I was told a lot of other things to make my image better, which included things when I joined the firm, I made sure not to hang out with other Black people so I wouldn't create bad perceptions. Direct comparisons to me and a previous analyst who had been continually referred to as a good analyst but a even though I had none of those experiences at the firm. I was told by another Black woman that I had to fix my attitude and be more team focused because people were noticing that I didn't want to be there, despite my attitude not being any different from the other analysts. Except for the fact that I cried in the staircase every day, which was a fun time. In that conversation, I was also warned that I had to look more professional relative to the other analysts. I was also told at that meeting that people didn't want to work with me. I also expressed a lot of these concerns to our team manager, and the conversation we had was just super tone deaf. He said that while he was apologetic for my experience, he couldn't change the past. He denied that coworkers would say the comments that I had reported. And when I was discussing a lot of this, he was like, well, do you think this is because you make a lot of mistakes? And I was like, do you think I make a lot of mistakes? Is that my feedback? Because I've only ever heard that I'm a good analyst. And he was like, well, no one said that, but I'm just curious if that could be the reason. And I was like, if that's gonna be the feedback, you should be giving me that feedback. But it doesn't make sense to bring it up kind of as a hypothetical when I'm bringing up racial and cultural concerns about the team. At no point I'd ever disagreed with feedback I was given, especially when it was outside of me raising cultural concerns. When attempting to explain why I was concerned about hiring another Black woman onto our team, my manager said if I wanted to not do that, I just would only hire white men, but I continue to hire Black people and women. That was a cool comment. And then when talking about the broader culture for the team, he mentioned the lawsuit that the team had suffered and said, I assure what you heard wasn't true, she was just bad at her job. This document goes on to outline solutions that I would have had, but I don't really think that that's necessarily fair. It wasn't on me to fix my company culture. I just think that over and over, Goldman Sachs showed that they weren't willing to value Black people's quality of life, and I think you'll hear that from a lot of other Black analysts. There was a lot of incidents after George Floyd, things like Black Lives Matter being compared to the Holocaust by a senior HR professional. During like a firm-wide meeting, there was a senior partner who was like, I didn't know that racism still existed. I didn't know that Goldman Sachs employees experienced racism. Just like a lack of awareness of the world around them. So when they're launching all these programs to like do good, it just feels really hollow because the quality of life for people in general, but especially Black people at the firm, wasn't very good. And I guess what's like really frustrating here is that I don't have a solution for how Goldman can be better. The culture's bad, and allocating funds to Black women doesn't change the fact that your internal culture for Black people is exclusive and terrible. And that was just a little bit of like my overall experience. That doesn't talk about the days that I sobbed in elevators or hallways. It doesn't talk about the fact that I quit my job because I was crying when I walked up to 200 West Street. Like, I can't remember of the last 2 months that I worked at Goldman, a day that I didn't walk into the office like in tears. That's horrific. And yeah, working 80-hour work weeks isn't super sustainable and isn't great, but it's made way worse when you can't stand the culture or people that you're working with. I also want to say that there were a lot of really good people at Goldman Sachs. I had wonderful mentors and wonderful people who told me over and over that my experience wasn't okay and that I didn't deserve what was happening to me and all of that. But at the end of the day, that wasn't enough to make me stay at a company where I was treated like every day. And while I was at Goldman, I offered solutions. I asked to switch teams because I was on a team that I didn't pick myself and I didn't apply for. I asked to switch teams multiple times. I was continually told that they had no headcount anywhere else at the firm until the day that I quit. On the day that I quit, multiple job opportunities magically became available despite the fact that I had been asking for months to not have to work with my team anymore. The day I quit, I was told that there were 2 seats in New York that I could potentially have and 2 seats in LA that I could have. I had been asking to move for months. I don't really have a solution. And I guess that's where this sucks. Like, it just feels like I'm ranting and I haven't wanted to do that. But I think it's really important that people going to Goldman Sachs know what culture they're getting themselves into. Whatever diversity programming they said was built out or said existed just didn't happen to be there when I got there. And I have multiple friends who came to Goldman and left primarily due to racism. That's ridiculous. And they only seem to care the moment that a Black person is leaving, the moment that the numbers are affected, the moment that they're concerned that they're going to be sued later. And I guess it's a plea that as Goldman looks at analyst culture and the firm's culture and what's an acceptable workplace, that they really also take a hard look at how their people of color are being treated on a daily basis. Because what's happening in 200 West Street and all around the world in Goldman Sachs offices isn't okay. It's not humane, it is absolutely ridiculous, and it allows for racism and other things like that to just run absolutely rampant. And until Goldman Sachs fixes these issues, you're just gonna see Black people coming in and out the door because the work life is not okay. I have tons of other peers that have very similar stories, could provide you with other crazy sound bites, and who are no longer at the firm because the environment was not sustainable. And I hope that Goldman Sachs finally takes these complaints and concerns seriously and does something to better the culture that they've created and allowed to run rampant. And I think what's really hard is that places like this are hard to speak out against because they're so big and so coveted, but also people don't want to speak out until they can provide solutions. My 5-page document has 5 bullets on areas of my experience that could have been improved and ways to do it going forward, etc., etc., etc. And that's great, but also that's not my job. I shouldn't have to be a part-time diversity consultant to be able to get my work done outside of that. I would love to be able to walk into a room in finance and not only be the Black voice or the Black female voice. I don't know, it's just sad. And the last thing I want to say is that I recognize the privilege I have to have Goldman Sachs on my resume. I know that the name Goldman Sachs is in part why I got my next job. I know their training is why I'm competent in a lot of spaces. I know that the work experience I got there was really great to work in finance, but I feel like I sit here and I'm like, at what cost did I get those things? To be honest with you, I don't know if that's worth the therapy and the crying and the trauma bonding and the trauma road shows you had to go on to tell people about how devastating your daily life was to have them just not understand you. You don't get to just come in crisis and build those people up. It's a sustained engagement that makes diversity in a workplace feasible. And honestly, Goldman Sachs does not have that at the moment. I hope this was helpful if you're considering a career at Goldman or thinking about what racism in finance could look like, because a lot of times are really small and hard to catch. And I spent a lot of time talking to people, namely white people at the firm, being like, do you think this was racist? At the end of the day, all the little microaggressions really did add up and really did affect my mental state, and I was so wary every day with everything that I said that it was just never gonna last for more than like the bare minimum amount of time that I had to put in to get out. And to be super clear, I don't think it's just Goldman Sachs. I have friends who say the same thing about racism or homophobia or sexism or whatever about all of these big banks. I don't know any minority individual who has come out of one of these institutions and been like, I had no racist, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, whatever experience. And that's not okay. It's not okay for these institutions to be traumatizing people and teaching them that that's the norm. Which is why I think it's so important to stand up and say something if you have the ability to do so. I hope this was helpful for you. Feel free to like and subscribe or share this with people you think are in finance. And I'm happy to be a resource if you need it. Thanks so much.